Good morning, welcome back. And in recent videos, as you know, I've described in quite some detail the causes and the consequences of the first arrival of the Black Death here in England in 1348. Well, in this clip and the next, I'm going to be moving forward 3 centuries. We've all become aware, haven't we, of recent difficulties caused by a self-imposed quarantine. And I've heard often reports about supposedly unprecedented levels of angst and trauma felt throughout England. We've been here before, folks. We really have. And I have a remarkable tale to tell about an ancient Derbyshire village which in 1666 showed the most astonishing courage by submitting to its own courageous exile in the most appalling circumstances that you can imagine. And I'm talking about a really old settlement called Eyam, E-Y-A-M, which is a secluded village sitting quietly in the most beautiful Derbyshire hills. It can be a difficult place to find, particularly for first-time travellers, but 355 years ago, when the village was of course even more remote, nature found a way of exposing that settlement in the most brutal way imaginable. I've said it was old. Well, excavations have confirmed that during the Bronze Age human beings were settled there, and we know that the region was important to the Romans who mined lead in the valley, and that becomes apparent during heavy rain when you can see the red water trickling down the hillsides. The modern boundaries of Eyam were almost certainly established by the Anglo-Saxons sometime after the 5th century. The name actually translates to a settlement by the water. The fact that the population converted to Christianity at a very early stage is evidenced by an original 8th century stone cross, Anglo-Saxon style, which now stands in the churchyard of St Lawrence at Eyam. Most of the village's later prosperity was derived from lead mining, and the remains of several mines can still be seen in the surrounding countryside today. The place is beset by tourists looking for tales about the heroism and the dedication shown by the occupants between September 1665 and December 1666, which is the year of the Great Fire of London, incidentally. Despite all this public interest, the present-day villagers are absolutely determined to preserve the character of Eyam village. So what happened? Well, if you stand in Eyam Street to this day, facing St Lawrence Church, on your left, about 50 metres away, you will see a terrace of 3 17th century cottages, and they're known collectively as the Plague Cottages. It was during 1665 that a parcel was delivered to the middle cottage, and its contents changed the life of Eyam residents for all time. At that time, a lady called Mary Cooper lived in the centre cottage, and in March of 65, she married her second husband. Alexander Hadfield was his name, and we know from a surviving will that he was a tailor. Mary Hadfield, obviously as she became known, was already quite a wealthy woman by local contemporary standard, and it seems that she already had living with her in that middle cottage 2 sons from her first marriage. Also living there was a slightly mysterious figure called George Vickers. His status is unclear, but it's likely he was either a lodger or, more likely, a tailor's assistant. In any event, it was George Vickers who was to play the single most significant role in the tale which follows, because it was probably he who was first to die from the Great Pestilence. As I say, in the autumn of 1665, the box that's delivered to that middle cottage was written for the attention of the tailor, Alexander Hadfield. It seems that what he'd done is to purchase some second-hand clothing from London, intending to use their nearly new fashionable styles for patterns for local customers. In any event, when the box arrived, it seems that the contents may well have been damp, so George Vickers laid them out to dry off, of course, as anybody would. He became ill soon after exposing that cloth. And although the cause of his illness wasn't identified at the time, of course, it seems that what he'd done is to release the rat fleas within the cloth. They bit him and infected him with the bubonic plague bacillus. By the 6th of September, within 5 or 6 days of exposure, George Vickers was dead. He was buried the following day. The location of his grave, sadly, isn't known because he wasn't a local man and he didn't get a headstone, fairly standard practice at that time. He might well have been forgotten if the parish register hadn't recorded his unexpected and sudden death. It's clear that the cause of his death was unknown, and for that reason people in the village didn't feel a sense of panic and they weren't unduly worried. But when, after just over 2 weeks, Mrs. Hadfield's younger son from her first marriage, Edward Cooper, had died, followed by neighbours opposite, Peter Hawksworth and Thomas Thorpe, followed by 12-year-old Mary Thorpe, who was buried on the 30th of September, people began to ask questions. A lady called Sarah Siddle lived in the house opposite. And when she died on the 30th of September, it meant that within 24 days, 6 people from immediately neighbouring properties had died. And the community began to realise that something sinister in that area was at play. You can easily imagine, can you not, that the horror and the fear generated amongst the community. People didn't understand how or why the plague spread so quickly. But in the absence of rational and scientific explanations, they believed that it was a result of God's wrath, as I've mentioned in previous videos. It was supposedly a divine punishment, which had to be endured at all costs. And in their ignorance, residents started to look for telltale signs of religious or supernatural interventions. It had been reported earlier in the year that some village boys, would you believe, had allowed cows to enter Eyam church. And unsurprisingly, the cows had apparently fouled the nave of the church. And members of the congregation began to wonder whether this was sufficient to anger a vengeful God. People identified omens that seem quite ridiculous to us today, such as sightings of white crickets on domestic hearths. But to the residents of a 17th century village, these omens were real and they were revealing. We don't know how many people actually fled Eyam in those very first few weeks when things were starting to go wrong. But the majority of people couldn't just lock up their properties and possessions any more than we can today. They couldn't leave the source of their only livelihood and income. Certainly neighbouring communities would have become immediately hostile to travellers leaving a plague village. So those who left must have had houses or relatives nearby. We know that 14 miles away, Sheffield Village erected barriers and posted guards to prevent infected strangers entering the town. Some villagers did in fact seek shelter outside, but close to the village, making makeshift homes on a moor nearby, Eyam Moor, often in fields or sometimes in caves. In October 1665, a month down the line, Mary Hadfield lost her only other surviving son, Jonathan Cooper. In total, 29 people died during that October, which exceeded the average annual figure for the entire village. People knew that bubonic plague was a summer disease, and they expected and hoped that it would end with the onset of winter. Unfortunately, and unbeknown to the residents, the rats and their deadly cargoes of fleas were able to continue quite comfortably, thank you, and existed in the warmth amongst the food within the cottages. The following spring, by April 1666, after 7 months of plague, we know that 73 citizens died in Eyam. Mercifully, perhaps, there were only 4 deaths in May, and villagers had good reason to think, or at least hope, that the worst was over. Unfortunately, the lull proved to be a false dawn. Many families had already suffered terrible tragedies. The Siddle family had lost 6 out of 8 family members, and their neighbours, the Thorpes, lost all 9. Today, as you can see, wall plaques are fitted to properties that were affected, and they articulate in very, very fine detail the devastation and the horrific losses that occurred inside each labelled cottage. In the heat of summer, June 1666, there was a sudden and very dramatic increase in the death toll. A number of children were sent away at that time, including those of an interesting man, the rector, William Montpesson. His wife Catherine had pleaded with him to take them all away to safety, but the rector was a loyal and courageous man. He refused on the grounds that his duty lay in the village. And whilst the children were eventually sent away to friends in Yorkshire, Catherine Montpesson stayed on in Eyam with her husband. Now, it was in that June 1666 that a story really begins to turn to the incredible, because William Montpesson took decisive action. He knew that somebody had to take control of a deteriorating situation, and in the absence of a local squire, who seems to have abandoned the village, the parson stepped forward. But first he had to overcome some local difficulties. He was only 28, a newcomer to Eyam, a relatively inexperienced youngster in the eyes of a village. Sadly, much like the rest of England, over the previous years, the village had emerged from a very troubled period as far as religious worship was concerned. Previous rectors had already disagreed over religious forms of worship, and the Eyam congregation at that time was very divided. A man called Rector Thomas Stanley, a staunch Puritan, had just returned to the village. He was experienced. There was a big age difference between him and Montpesson. He was respected and established, so the younger Montpesson must have found things a little bit difficult to get things done. However, and thankfully, as the plague took hold, those 2 men from different paths, Stanley and Montpesson, got a grip. They put aside their differences and worked to a common agenda. Much of what followed was actually later attributed to the actions and the leadership of William Montpesson, but I think there was very much a shared load between Stanley and Montpesson, and they played equally significant roles. And in that summer, May or June of 1666, those 2 men, Montpesson and Stanley, met several times to work out an appropriate strategy. They had never been here before, but they devised a plan that was described to the villagers. And it was the results of those meetings which eventually has brought Eyam to the attention of millions of people from around the world. So what were those decisions? Well, the community response to the plague was based on 3 principles. First, there were to be no more organised funerals or churchyard burials. People were advised to bury their own dead in their gardens, orchards and surrounding fields. Actually, some of those sad, isolated tombs which were created in the landscape at that time can still be seen. The clergy, with the assistance of his wife Catherine, devoted her care and energy away from the church building itself to caring for the sick, the dying and the bereaved. The community were disturbed because they believed that they were condemned to a life in hell if they were laid to rest in ground that had not been consecrated. Since most villagers were unable to read or write, many graves and tombstones of that period were unmarked. The decision was marked by a real but slightly misplaced fear of corpses spreading the infection. It was considered essential at that time that bodies were disposed of very, very quickly, and horrendously, they were dragged hurriedly to their resting places by means of ropes, blankets, sheets, or even doors. There are no records of any mass graves as were seen all over Europe in the 14th century, although several bodies were buried in groups, as can be seen in the Miners' Arms Croft and at the glorious bowl of land with the unusual name of Coquelet Delph. Certainly several victims were buried in the hillside behind the church. The second decision was that the church should be locked and services were to be held in the open air until the epidemic was over. The congregation didn't know specifically how the plague was spread, but they were well aware that it was deadly at close quarters, and they considered, interestingly, that people should be engaged only at a safe distance of at least 12 feet. Montpesson chose this bowl of land called Coquelet Delph as the site for open-air worship, and that is a most amazing place. It has a large natural rock within the bowl of land, which served as a pulpit for William Montpesson. To this day, an annual service of thanksgiving is held in and around that rock place on the last Sunday in every August. I've been there several times. It is the most moving and astonishing experience, believe me. Third and finally, and certainly the most incredible and courageous decision of all three, concerned the imposition of what they called a cordon sanitaire around the village. The residents elected to place themselves in quarantine so as to halt the spread of the disease. No one was permitted to leave Eyam, and none were allowed to enter. It's difficult for modern visitors to understand what motivated them to take such a heroic decision. They were certainly very religious, and the suggestion must have been put to the villagers by Montpesson and Stanley in a very religious context. That's it for this first clip. In the second, I'm going to conclude by the effects and consequences on Eyam village and a little bit about how it looks today. Thank you for your attention.